Hello, ma'am.
Hello. Just give me a second. I'll just Okay, so in the last class we had started reading this essay, What is Enlightenment? And let's do a little bit of recap. We read how this question, what is enlightenment, has been posed by a German magazine, and how there were two respondents to it. One of them was Immanuel Kant and the other was Moses Mendelssohn. And the discussion starts off from there of how Kant tried to answer this question, what is enlightenment? In fact, his Kant's own work is called Answering the Question, What is Enlightenment? And in this we read, yes, we read what Foucault has to say about Kant's answer that he gave to the question, what is enlightenment? And in the process, he also tells us about the Jewish enlightenment, which is called the Haskalah. And then Kant says how, Foucault says how Kant's text poses some issues, of which one was about the reflection on the present. And Foucault underlines three ways in which the present has been, dealt with or has been analyzed or understood. And one would be where he gives Plato's example, and he says that the present has been taken as a specific or a particular or distinguished era, which is different from the others when compared to others. Then he says that the present has also been understood as a herald of a forthcoming event, and he gives the example of Saint Augustine's theory of divine illumination. Then the past has been taken or understood as a point of transition towards a new world view, towards a new world. And he gives the example of Vico, the Italian philosopher, who talked about today or the present as a radiant humanity. Now, Kant poses or deals with this question in a different way, and he says he looks at the present not in these three ways of how different people have looked at it, but rather he looks at it as a kind of an exit, as a way out. And he uses this word, Ausgang, which means an exit or a way out. And then Foucault explains what Kant meant by Ausgang or exit, he meant it was a way out from our immaturity. It was how, Kant found a way. Just a minute. Just a minute. Okay. So for Kant, the present was a time when one could get an exit or an escape from one's immaturity. Okay, and it was one could get a release from immaturity. Then Foucault says that Kant also saw, you know, he linked this with enlightenment, and then he says that he also saw in it something that is a heraldic device, which he calls a Wahlspruch, which is a kind of a motto, and this motto was dare to know, dare to know, and so Kant considered the Enlightenment as a process in which people collectively as well as individually should have this act of courage, should have this daring to know. After that, he talks about Kant's use of the word mankind, and he says, he analyzes what Kant could have meant by the word mankind, whether he meant the entire human race or whether he meant only humanity. In either case, if it was the human race, then it would be something that would be external. Uh, and if it was humanity, it would be something that was internal. Now, after that, Kant talks about two ways in which mankind can escape immaturity, and those two ways are spiritual as well as institutional. And what are these two ways? He talks about the private and the public use of reason. So the realm of obedience and the realm of the use of reason. Then he explains what is the private use of reason and what is the public use of reason. Okay. So the private use of reason is when a person is, acts as a minor part of a larger organization, as a part of society. And in that use of reason, in his private use of reason, he is limited, he is restricted. Whereas in the public use of reason, or the public use of reason is where he acts as a reasonable person, and where he uses reason for its own sake, not because he is a part of any system or anything. And there he is free to use his reason to its utmost limits. Okay. So again, Kant says that there is enlightenment when the universal, the free, and the public uses of reason are superimposed on one another. After that, where we stopped is where he says that enlightenment, when it integrates both these aspects, the private as well as the public use of reason, then it becomes a political problem or a political issue. Okay. And it appears as a political problem, meaning how the use of reason can take the public form that it requires, and how the audacity to know can be exercised in broad daylight. And then he gives an example of Frederick II, who was a rational despot, and how Kant proposed this, system to him, so as to say, this program to him, in which he could allow his subjects to the free and autonomous use of reason, and that in itself would be a guarantee of their obedience. So we stopped there.
The universal reason, he says.
Okay, so we'll continue from there. Okay. Anything you want to ask before we move on?
Ma'am, from which page number is it? Actually, I'm not able to find.
So we
37?
stopped at 37.
Yeah.
37. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, so now let's come back to this, the last paragraph on page, the second last paragraph on page 37. Let us leave Kant's text here. I do not by any means propose to consider it as capable of constituting an adequate description of enlightenment, and no historian, I think, could be satisfied with it for an analysis of the social, political, and cultural transformations that occurred at the end of the 18th century. Nevertheless, notwithstanding its circumstantial nature, and without intending to give it an exaggerated place in Kant's work, I believe that it is necessary to stress the connection that exists between this brief article and the three critiques. The brief article meaning Kant's What is Enlightenment, that essay on enlightenment, and the three critiques. I think we mentioned, we had come across these three critiques earlier also, where I mentioned that Kant was most famous for the three critiques that he wrote: the critique of pure reason and practical reason, and his critique of judgment. And in all these three, very seminal texts, what he was talking mostly about was using knowledge to know our world, how a human being can use knowledge to know about the world, or rather he was talking about the power of human reason, and like the restrictions, the limits, and the extent to which a human being could use his power of reasoning in order to understand the world, in order to know about the world. Okay, so Foucault says that there is a connection between this essay by Kant and his three critiques. Kant, in fact, describes enlightenment as the moment when humanity is going to put its own reason to use without subjecting itself to any authority. Now, it is precisely at this moment that the critique is necessary, since its role is that of defining the conditions under which the use of reason is legitimate, in order to determine what can be known, what must be known, and what may be hoped. So, this is one way in which Kant had described or understood enlightenment as the moment when a human being could put his reason to reason to use without being, subjected, without being superimposed by any other external authority. And why is that necessary? Why should that moment when when humanity could be able to put its reason to use without subjecting itself to authority be enlightenment? Because that is the moment when human beings, or when humanity is able to define the conditions under which their use of reason can be legitimate, so that they may know what are the limits of knowledge which they have to cover through their use of reason. The conditions in which the use of reason is legitimate, in order to determine what can be known, what must be known, and what may be hoped. So in order to get a clear vision of how far their knowledge can extend, they have to be able to use their reason without subjecting it to any authority. Illegitimate uses of reason are what give rise to dogmatism and heteronomy, along with illusion on the other hand. So here now Kant has made a distinction, and not Kant, Foucault. Foucault has made a distinction between the legitimate and the illegitimate uses of reason. The legitimate use of reason would be there where a human being, or where humanity is able to determine the extent of knowledge he or she has to cover. And the illegitimate use of reason are those areas which give rise to what is dogmatism. Now, what is dogmatism? What is dogmatism?
Ma'am, having two meanings of a concept or something.
No,
Yes.
not having true meanings of a concept, but rather dogmatism is insistence on,
As a,
but yes, somebody else was saying something.
ma'am, it is assertion of rules. Like, as you told in the last class, that dogmatism means assertion of rules.
It is an assertion of rules, but rules which are, which belong to a particular person, or as interpreted by a particular person or a particular group. It is not something that is universal. It is not something which can be understood universally, but rather it is something which depends on, limited interpretation, and an insistence on that as the universal truth is dogmatism. Okay. Now, dogmatism would be very close to what we could say fanatism, where you insist on something as you think of it or as you interpret it. Okay. So this dogmatism happens, or is given rise to by the illegitimate use of reason and heteronomy. Now, heteronomy means being under the, again, domination of an outside authority. So dogmatism, heteronomy, and illusion, these are the things which happen when there is an illegitimate use of reason, when a person does not know how he can use his free reason and to what extent he can use his free reason, and what are the conditions in which he can use his free reason. So it is when the legitimate use of reason has been clearly defined in its principles that its autonomy can be assured. So, this is vice versa, that the use of reason in its legitimate manner will give rise to more scope for the legitimate use of reason. Otherwise, it will end up as something which is illusion, misconception, false belief, dogmatism. So he says, it is when the legitimate use of reason has been clearly defined in its principles that its autonomy can be assured. The critique is, in a sense, the handbook of reason that has grown up in enlightenment. And conversely, the enlightenment is the age of the critique. So the critique here would be an inquiry, a critical inquiry into the power of reason and into the limits of reason or the legitimate use of reason. So the critique is the handbook of reason that that was created, or that grew, that was developed during the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is the age when this kind of a critique, now here the word critique is being used in a general manner, where this kind of an exercise can be undertaken. Okay. It is also necessary, I think, to underline the relation between this text of Kant's and the other texts he devoted to history. These latter, for the most part, seek to define the internal teleology of time and the point toward which history of humanity is moving. Now, the analysis of enlightenment, defining this history as humanity's passage to its adult status, situates contemporary reality with respect to the overall movement and its basic directions. But at the same time, it shows how, at this very moment, each individual is responsible in a certain way for that overall process. So, Foucault says that the other texts that Kant wrote, and these other texts were texts such as the universal natural history, then religion within the bounds of bare reason, metaphysics of morals. These were other texts that Kant wrote in addition to the three critiques. And here Foucault is comparing this text on enlightenment to these other, texts that Kant wrote. And he says that the latter texts, they seek to define the internal teleology of time. Now, I explained to you that the meaning of teleology is the exploration of any phenomena in terms of the purpose that they serve, why they are there, why are they in that shape, why are they in that design, in that pattern. That is teleology. Okay. So the other texts, what they were looking at was the manner in which those particular patterns of time, how those particular things in time were functioning, or let's see what he says over here. Seek to define the internal teleology of time and the point towards which history of humanity is moving. So he was trying to analyze why those things took place as they did and how they have contributed towards the history of the progress of humanity. But this analysis of enlightenment, defining this history as humanity's passage to its adult status. Now, enlightenment, he looks at enlightenment not from its teleological viewpoint, but rather he defines it as humanity's passage to its adult status and situates contemporary reality with respect to the overall movement and its basic directions, meaning that his analysis of enlightenment gives a place to this use of knowledge, or rather the legitimate way of using reason for gaining knowledge. That is how he analyzes the enlightenment, and that is how humanity passes from its immature status to the adult status. But at the same time, Foucault says, it shows how at this very moment, each individual is responsible in a certain way for that overall process. So what he means to say here is that though Kant may have looked at enlightenment as the history of entire humanity's passage to its adult status, at the same time, he is also looking at how each individual is responsible for this overall process, for this overall passage of humanity from immaturity to the adult status. Okay. So he has analyzed enlightenment in two aspects. One is from the aspect of entire humanity, and the other is from the aspect of an individual. Okay. The hypothesis I should like to propose is that this little text is located, in a sense, at the crossroads of critical reflection and reflection on history. So that is what he means here, that the hypothesis or the supposition with which he is moving forward, Foucault is moving forward in his understanding of Kant's explanation of enlightenment, is that this text by Kant on enlightenment is located at the crossroads, you know what the crossroad juncture, where both cross each other, of critical reflection and reflection on history. Again, meaning that it is something that is related to the entire humanity, and at the same time, it is also something that relates to an individual's use of reason, okay, or development of critical faculties. It is a reflection by Kant on the contemporary status of his own enterprise. His own enterprise meaning his own attempt, or his own arguments, his individual efforts at understanding or gaining knowledge about something. No doubt, it is not the first time that a philosopher has given his reasons for undertaking his work at a particular moment, but it seems to me that it is the first time that a philosopher has connected in this way, closely and from the inside, the significance of his work with respect to knowledge, a reflection on history, and a particular analysis of the specific moment at which he is writing, and because of which he is writing. Now, what does this mean? It means that Foucault says that Kant has been able to connect three things at the same time. The first one is the significance of his work with respect to knowledge. how he has been able to gain knowledge about anything about the world, or about the use of reason or whatever. So the significance of his work with respect to knowledge. The second one is a reflection on history. What is enlightenment with relation to the entire history of humanity, and a particular analysis of the specific moment at which he is writing and because of which he is writing. Now, this is important, that he analyzes that particular moment in which he is writing as a result of something which has given him the power to be able to write, which has been able to, which has helped him or which has empowered him in writing. Okay, so what is this? This is the realization, his realization of the proper and legitimate use of reason. You know, because he has been able to understand what is the legitimate use of reason, that he has been able to actually do so, and that is the reason why he has been able to write about it. Okay. It is in the reflection on today as difference in history and as motive for a particular philosophical task that the novelty of this text appears to me to lie. So today for Kant is that time, today meaning the present, is that moment when he has been able to understand what is the power of reason, how reason can be used legitimately, what are the areas, what are the extents to which reason can be used, and why should reason be used, how one must use reason, and what one may hope for through the use of reason. So it is in emphasizing this that Foucault says that the novelty of the text lies for me. Okay. And by looking at it in this way, it seems to me we may recognize a point of departure, the outline of what one might call the attitude of modernity. So he says that this realization, this knowledge in itself is what is called the attitude of modernity. I know that modernity is often spoken of as an epoch, or at least as a set of features characteristic of an epoch, situated on a calendar. It would be preceded by a more or less naive or archaic pre-modernity, and followed by an enigmatic and troubling post-modernity. And then we find ourselves asking whether modernity constitutes the sequel to the Enlightenment and its development, or whether we are to see it as a rupture or a deviation with respect to the basic principles of the 18th century. Now, here in this first paragraph, it is just, he's just trying to tell us how modernity, this word modernity, or the concept of modernity, has been generally understood. It has been understood as one specific period, that can be pointed out on the calendar, dates, the dates of which can be pointed out, that modernity was a period in the history of humanity which began on this date and which ended on this date. And this period of modernity, it was preceded by a period which was called pre-modernity, and it was succeeded by a period called post-modernity. Now, this is how it is generally understood. Okay. And then Foucault says that in that case, we find ourselves asking whether modernity constitutes the sequel to the Enlightenment, whether it was an epoch or a period which followed the Enlightenment and its development, or whether it was something which was a deviation which took place at the same time as the Enlightenment, but which took a separate trajectory, or which took a separate course, which deviated from the discourse of the Enlightenment. Thinking back on Kant's text, I wonder whether we may not envisage modernity rather as an attitude than as a period of history. So now Foucault says that taking Kant's essay or text as the base, what he would rather like to think, or what he would rather like to advocate, is that modernity is not a period of history, rather it is an attitude. And by attitude, I mean a mode of relating to contemporary reality, a voluntary choice made by certain people, in the end, a way of thinking and feeling, a way too of acting and behaving that at one and the same time marks a relation of belonging and presents itself as a task. A bit, no doubt, like what the Greeks called an ethos. So this is what is Foucault's understanding of modernity, that it is not a period that can be marked on the calendar, rather it is an attitude. And what kind of an attitude is it? He says it is a way of feeling, it is a way of thinking and, acting. It is a way in which we can relate to the contemporary reality. It is a way in which we can make more sense of our contemporary reality. And it is something that is a voluntary choice made by people. People can, choose to be modern in their attitude, or they can choose not to be modern in their attitude. So he says, he compares it to what the Greeks call an ethos. Now, what is an ethos? An ethos is a complete, you can say, it is almost a complete identity that somebody has about how one feels, about how one thinks, how one behaves, and what is the, so as to say, what is the character of that person, or, ethos is something, actually, literally in Greek, it means custom or character. But we take it to mean the entire identity of something is its ethos. All the features, all the characteristics of something add up to build up create its ethos. Okay. So Foucault says that modernity is something like an ethos. And consequently, rather than seeking to distinguish the modern era from the pre-modern or post-modern, I think it would be more useful to try to find out how the attitude of modernity, ever since its formation, has found itself struggling with attitudes of counter-modernity. Okay, so like he said, it is a voluntary choice. Modernity is an attitude which is a voluntary choice made by people. And at all times, this attitude of modernity is always countered by attitudes of the, in the opposite direction, that is, which he calls counter-modernity. To characterize briefly this attitude of modernity, I shall take an almost indispensable example, namely Baudelaire, for his consciousness of modernity is widely recognized as one of the most acute in the 19th century. So he is going to take up the, example of Baudelaire, who is a French poet and critic. And it was Charles Baudelaire who coined the word modernite. Modernite or modernity. It was he who came up with this word, and this word which he coined, it meant to convey the the experience of life in an urban city, that experience of life which is fleeting, which is temporary, which is momentary, which is not permanent. And also the response of art to that feeling of, that ephemeral feeling, that feeling of temporal, something being temporal. Okay. So he says that I shall take this almost indispensable example of Baudelaire, for his consciousness of modernity is widely recognized as one of the most acute in the 19th century. Okay. So now let's see what he takes from Baudelaire's understanding of modernity, or philosophy of modernity. He says, modernity is often characterized in terms of consciousness of the discontinuity of time, a break with tradition, a feeling of novelty, of vertigo in the face of the passing moment. And this is indeed what Baudelaire seems to be saying when he defines modernity as the ephemeral, the fleeting, the contingent. Okay, so for Baudelaire, this is what modernity is. It is the ephemeral. Ephemeral ka matlab transitory, and fleeting is also something that is speedily, going away, fading. And contingent means something that depends upon some condition, something that is conditional. So Baudelaire defines modernity as something that is ephemeral, something that is fleeting, and something that is contingent. Okay. And Foucault has earlier said that modernity is characterized in terms of consciousness of the discontinuity of time. That something, it is the same as contingent. The discontinuity of time is the same as something being contingent, happening at as a consequence of some particular things, but some things which are not going to be permanent, things which are going to be only for a little while. So, and also a feeling of novelty and a vertigo in the face of the passing moment. What is vertigo?
It is a cervical related phenomena in which the ear loses the balance, and while we sleep or while we wake up, we find the spinning around of the things and all, like there's an unbalance.
Okay, so it is a kind vertigo here would mean that spinning of the mind, where you're not able to grasp things, properly or fully or completely. So a vertigo in the face of the passing moment, when you are in a way taken aback, awed, taken aback by the passing moment. Okay. So Baudelaire says that he defines modernity as the ephemeral, the fleeting, and the contingent. But for him, being modern does not lie in recognizing and accepting this perpetual movement. On the contrary, it lies in adopting a certain attitude with respect to this movement. And this deliberate, difficult attitude consists in recapturing something eternal that is not beyond the present instant, nor behind it, but within it. Okay, so for Baudelaire, being modern means being able to capture something from the present moment which can be made eternal. Because, and why, what is the need to capture it? Because that something does not exist beyond the present moment, nor does it exist behind it, but it exists only in the present. Okay, it is something that can be found only in the present moment, and that something has to be, captured. It has to be caught hold of, and it has to be made eternal or permanent. That is the attitude of modernity according to Baudelaire. So modernity is distinct from fashion, which does no more than call into question the course of time. Modernity is the attitude that makes it possible to grasp the heroic aspect of the present moment. Modernity is not a phenomenon of self. Okay, so according to Baudelaire, according to Baudelaire, modernity is not synonymous with fashion, or fashion is not modernity, because fashion is something which has its value and significance only in time. But modernity is an attitude that grasps the heroic aspect of the present moment. It grasps the the value of the present moment, and it makes it eternal. So modernity is not a phenomenon of sensitivity to the fleeting moment. You are not only sensitive to the fact that this moment is not going to last forever, that this moment is fleeting. Rather, it is the attitude or the will to heroize the present. Heroize means to, separate that something from the present moment and to make it, to glorify it, okay, to celebrate it or to glorify it. I shall restrict myself to what Baudelaire says about the painting of his contemporaries. Baudelaire makes fun of those painters who, finding 19th century dress excessively ugly, want to depict nothing but ancient togas. But modernity in painting does not constitute for Baudelaire in introducing black clothing onto the canvas. The modern painter is the one who can show the dark frock coat as the necessary costume of our time, the one who knows how to make manifest in the fashion of the day the essential, permanent, obsessive relation that our age entertains with death. Now, this is an example that Foucault has taken up from Baudelaire's argument, and he says that I'm going to take up this point which Baudelaire makes about his contemporary painters, about the painting of his contemporaries. And Baudelaire does not think much about those painters who, because they find 19th century dress very ugly, they want to paint only ancient togas, meaning they don't make paintings where people are wearing the contemporary style of dress, because they think it is very ugly. So they depict only costumes of ancient times. Now he says, but modernity in painting does not consist for Baudelaire in introducing black clothing onto the canvas. But at the same time, there are also painters who may be painting the 19th century style of dressing, the 19th century fashion of dressing, which was these black frock coats and dress coats. So there were painters who painted the black dress coats and the frock coats, but the manner in which they presented them, he says, the modern painter is the one who can show the dark frock coat as the necessary costume of our time, the one who knows how to make manifest in the fashion of the day, meaning there are some paintings which perhaps painters have been able to depict the frock coat and the dress coat, which was the fashion of the 19th century, these black dresses, black clothes, which was the fashion of the 19th century, as something which was essentially connected to the ethos of the time, something that was, very closely connected or very well woven into the ethos of the time. So the modern painter is the one who can show the dark frock coat as the necessary costume of our time. And how would they show that it was the necessary costume of the time? Because they would connect it in some way with the age which, and the 19th century was the age which entertained death. Now he says that the painter who knows how to make manifest, meaning who knows how to make that fact very evident, very obvious, that this fashion of the day, this manner of wearing black coats is, it has a relation to the age, which is the age that entertains death. Now, the dress coat and frock coat not only possess their political beauty, which is an expression of universal equality, but also their poetic beauty, which is an expression of the public soul, an immense cortege of undertakers' mutes in love, political mutes, bourgeois mutes. Okay, so he says that how would painters be able to do that? And why does he say that it is painters would be able to do that by, making it obvious that they were relating this black dress to the ethos of the time. And the ethos of the time was that it was a time which entertained death, which spoke largely about death. So the political beauty of the dress coat and the frock coat is that it is understood to be the kind of dress that was worn by the political leaders, by the statesmen of the time. It was considered to be politically correct to be wearing that kind of a dress. But it also had its poetic beauty. And what was that poetic beauty? It was an expression of the public soul. And that public soul, what was that public soul? He gives an image over here to depict what the public soul or the public ethos of that time was. He says an immense cortege of undertakers' mutes. Now, cortege cortege here means is a procession, a ceremonial procession, and undertakers, are people who are kind of who manage funerals. The undertaker is the person who manages the rituals of the funeral, who organizes, so as to say, this function of a funeral. Undertakers mutes, and mutes are the mourners, the people who mourn. Now, if you have seen a funeral procession, in that all people, they wear black. Black is the color of the funeral procession. Okay, so the poetic beauty of the frock coat or the dress code can be brought out only by those painters who are able to, associate it with the ethos of death of the 19th century, and who are able to express through their painting this kind of a this kind of an image, which would be like the image that he is talking about, the ceremonial procession of mourners, who are all wearing black. Okay, and now here, this funeral that he talks about, or these mourners, they are not only mourners of actual physical death of a person, but they could be also talking about, or they could also be expressing, these paintings could be expressing mutes in love. They could be talking about political mutes or bourgeois mutes, meaning death. Death, in its metaphorical way, death in its metaphorical way in these different areas. We are each of us celebrating some funeral. To designate this attitude of modernity, Baudelaire sometimes employs a litotes that is highly significant because it is presented in the form of a precept. You have no right to despise the present. Okay, so now this is the attitude of modernity that Baudelaire seems to employ. Now, what is this attitude that he is talking about with relation to painters? He says that a painter should be able to paint something not only to depict it as fashion, because fashion is something that is temporary, but he should be able to relate it to the ethos of the time. He should be able to create that kind of imagery which would give out this interpretation that it is expressing something that is intrinsic to the character of the time, to the existing you can say that existing attitude of that time, of that particular moment. And here Baudelaire, he employs a litotes. Now, you know what a litotes is? It is a figure of speech. It is a kind of an understatement in which the affirmative is expressed by the negative. So Baudelaire sometimes employs a litotes to express what is his concept of modernity. That is highly significant because it is presented in the form of a precept. You have no right to despise the present. Now, what would be the simple meaning of that? That you should, you should love the present. You should love the moment. You should celebrate the moment. That would be the meaning of this statement, that you have no right to despise the moment. And that is what is Baudelaire's interpretation of modernity, that it is a celebration of the moment. It is a
Is
of the present moment. Yes?
Ma'am, is it related to carpe diem, like used by metaphysical poets? Like they also use this particular term carpe diem to seize the day and all. So Is it related? The last line is related to that we have to enjoy the day.
Yes, it could be related to that. It's not only enjoy the day, but to find in each day or to find in each moment something which can be eternalized, which can be made into eternity, which can be made permanent, which can be made eternal, something which is so special in that moment that it can be captured forever. Okay, that is why he has used this word to capture the heroic, and then he says heroize. This is a new term that he has used, to heroize, that is to bring out something in that moment which is special and which can be made permanent. The moment is not permanent in itself. The present moment is fleeting. It is something that is ephemeral. But in that ephemeral moment also, one can find something which can be made eternal. Okay. It is something very similar to what Robert Browning has said in his last Ride Together, that it is not the past or the future that matters, but this last ride that I have with my beloved, this is all that is going to stay with me forever. The memory of this, the ecstasy, the joy of this is going to stay with me forever, though the moment itself is going to pass. Okay. Now, this heroization is ironical, needless to say. The attitude of modernity does not treat the passing moment as sacred in order to try to maintain or perpetuate it. It certainly does not involve harvesting it as a fleeting and interesting curiosity. That would be what Baudelaire would call the spectator's posture. The flaneur, that is the idle strolling spectator, is satisfied to keep his eyes open, to pay attention, and to build up a storehouse of memories. In opposition to the flaneur, Baudelaire describes the man of modernity. Away he goes, hurrying, searching. Be very sure that this man, this solitary gifted with an active imagination, ceaselessly journeying across the great human desert, has an aim loftier than that of a mere flaneur, an aim more general, something other than the fugitive pleasure of circumstance. He is looking for that quality which you must allow me to call modernity. He makes it his business to extract from fashion whatever element it may contain of poetry within history. Okay, so now he says that this you can say act of heroization is something that is ironical. And why is it ironical? Because it does not treat the passing moment as sacred. The passing moment is not sacred, and he does not try to maintain or perpetuate it. Rather, he is looking for something in that passing moment. It is his business to extract from that passing moment any element that may contain of poetry within history, that may appear to him to be something that is poetic, something that may appeal to his, that has appealed to his soul, so as to say. A soulful something in the present moment is what has to be captured, and it is that which Baudelaire says is the spirit of, or the attitude of, modernity. Okay. So he gives the example here again of the flaneur, who is a spectator, a person who strolls around and who looks at everything with curiosity. He pays attention to everything so that he can put it all into his memory. But the man of modernity is not a mere flaneur. He is not a mere person who is trying to put everything of the present moment into his memory, who is trying to capture each and every part of the present moment so that he may think of it later. But it is somebody who has an active imagination and who has an aim which is loftier than that of the flaneur, and it is an aim which is more, he says, an aim more general, something other than the fugitive pleasure of circumstance. So it is not that he is only trying to capture the present moment in its entirety, in its totality, so that he can, keep it in his memory. Rather, he is trying to extract something from it. Okay, an element of poetry within history. As an example of modernity, Baudelaire cites the artist Constantin Guise. In appearance a spectator, a collector of curiosities, he remains the last to linger wherever there can be a glow of light, an echo of poetry, a quiver of life, or a chord of music. Wherever a passion can pose before him, wherever natural man and conventional man display themselves in a strange beauty, wherever the sun lights up the swift joys of the depraved animal. So now this Constantin Guise was a Dutch-born, French artist, and he was a painter and an illustrator for newspapers. So about him, Baudelaire says that he is an example of his attitude is an example of modernity. And how is that? Because he says he is the last to linger wherever there is even a shred of a glow of light or an echo of poetry or a quiver of light or a chord of music. Wherever passion poses before him, the swift joys of the depraved animal, meaning, the depraved animal. What is the depraved animal? Somebody who has a kind of a vacuum, emptiness, okay, inside. A depraved person is one who has some kind of an emptiness in his soul. Now, that thing which he can pick up from the present moment, which can fill up that emptiness, which can fill up that, vacuum in his soul, that is the modern attitude. To be able to find something in the present moment that gives a, sense of fulfillment, that answers or that fills up the emptiness, the deprivation, that is the modern attitude. And that is the thing which has to be separated from the present moment. Okay? Can you make sense of that?
Yes, ma'am.
But let us make no mistake, Constantin Guise is not a flaneur. What makes him the modern painter par excellence in Baudelaire's eyes is that just when the whole world is falling asleep, he begins to work and he transfigures that world. His transfiguration does not entail an annulling of reality, but a difficult interplay between the truth of what is real and the exercise of freedom. Natural things become more than natural, beautiful things become more than beautiful, and individual objects appear endowed with an impulsive life, like the soul of their creator. Okay, so that is what Baudelaire is talking about by the attitude of modernity. It is when a person is able to find in the present moment something which is more, which becomes more than natural, or which becomes to him something that is, something that is more special in a way, something that is more beautiful than the beautiful, and something that is endowed with the impulsive life like the soul of their creator. So something that identifies with the soul of the creator, or something which that person is able to identify with through his soul. Okay, something that aligns itself to his soul. That is what has to be captured. That is the beauty of the moment that has to be captured. For the attitude of modernity, the high value of the present is indissociable from a desperate eagerness to imagine it, to imagine it otherwise than it is, and to transform it, not by destroying it, by grasping it in what it is. Baudelairean modernity is an exercise in which extreme attention to what is real is confronted with the practice of a liberty that simultaneously respects this reality and violates it. Okay, so the attitude of modernity is to imagine something in that moment, to imagine it not exactly as it is in reality, but to imagine it in a different form, to transform it, to be able to imagine it and in a transformed form, not by destroying it, but by grasping it in what it is, by grasping the essence of that moment, by grasping something that appears to be more beautiful than the outlying beauty of it, and by transforming it with the help of one's imagination. And that is why Baudelaire says, according to him, modernity is an exercise in which extreme attention to what is real is confronted with the practice of a liberty that respects this reality and violates it, meaning finds that particular thing in the reality of the present moment, but at the same time also violates the reality of that moment by transforming that thing with the aid of the imagination. Okay, so that is the attitude of modernity, when we are able to when we are able to, in a way, channel or put in our imagination into the present moment, and we are able to transform that present moment into something that appears to be different from what it actually is at that time. Okay. So to imagine it otherwise than it is, and to transform it, not by destroying it, but by grasping it as it is. And okay, is that clear?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
However, modernity for Baudelaire is not simply a form of relationship to the present. It is also a mode of relationship that has to be established with oneself. The deliberate attitude of modernity is tied to an indispensable asceticism. Now, what is asceticism? It is a kind of a strict and very disciplined way of conduct, of attitude of doing something, of conducting oneself. To be modern is not to accept oneself as one is in the flux of the passing moment. It is to take oneself as object of a complex and difficult elaboration, what Baudelaire in the vocabulary of his day calls dandyism. Now, this is also very interesting. This is an interesting concept that Baudelaire talks about, the concept of the dandy. Now, you may have heard this word before, the dandy, D-A-N-D-Y. Yes. Okay, let's see what Baudelaire says. Here I shall not recall in detail the well-known passages on vulgar, earthy, vile nature, on man's indispensable revolt against himself, or on the doctrine of elegance, which imposes upon its ambitious and humble disciples a discipline more despotic than the most terrible religions. The pages finally on the asceticism of the dandy, who makes of his body, his behavior, his feelings and passions, his very existence, a work of art. Now, in general, understanding, the dandy is a person who loves to dress up, who loves to, show off himself, show off his manner of dressing, show off his attitude, which he thinks is superior to the others. that is a dandy, a fop, who is also called a fop, a person, who loves to exhibit himself in all his fashion. Okay. Now that is why Foucault says that I shall not recall in these are the general understandings of a dandy, that he is vulgar, he is earthy, he has a vile nature, and it is an indispensable revolt against himself, or that the dandy is the one who follows the doctrine of elegance, elegance in, sophistication, refinement, which may be superficial, which may not be actually very deep, uh, which imposes upon its ambitious and humble disciples a discipline more despotic than the most terrible religions. So, dandyism is not taken to be something very positive. It is taken to be something that is superficial, something that is terrible, something that is, vile, something that is vulgar. The page is finally on the asceticism of the dandy but what Foucault is going to consider is not these negative, views about the dandy, but rather he is going to consider those pages in which Baudelaire has written about the asceticism of the dandy, who makes of his body, his behavior, his feelings and passions, his very existence a work of art. Modern man for Baudelaire is not the man who goes off to discover himself, his secrets and his hidden truth. He is the man who tries to invent himself. This modernity does not liberate man in his own being. It compels him to face the task of producing himself. So Baudelaire says that what impresses him about the dandy, and what he wants to show again as an attitude of modernity, it is how one can be modern is to be a dandy, or being a dandy is one aspect of modernity. And which aspect of the dandy does he take as an attitude of modernity? It is that aspect of dandyism which he says is the ascetic aspect. And what is the ascetic aspect? The strict disciplinarian attitude that he has of making his behavior, his feelings, his passions, and his very existence a work of art. Meaning to say that he works upon himself as if he is a work of art. He tries to present himself as a work of art. He puts in all his efforts. He uses the strictest discipline in to be able to reinvent himself, as to say, or to produce himself. So modern man for Baudelaire is not the man who goes off to discover himself, his secrets and his hidden truths. It is not the man who is confused, who does not know what he is, and he goes off. He has to separate himself from society, so as to say, to discover himself, to discover his secrets and his hidden truths. Rather, the modern man is the man who tries to invent himself. The modern man is that man who is able to follow a strict discipline in his own presentation. He, in a way, he produces a deliberate image of himself, or he creates a deliberate image of himself. So this modernity does not liberate man in his own being. It compels him to face the task of producing himself. So that is the attitude of modernity, where a person cannot escape from the present. A person cannot escape from the realities of the present. Rather, the person has to find in the present those moments which can be glorified, those moments which can be celebrated. And he works very hard in a very sincere, very disciplined manner at reproducing that something which he finds so essential, which he finds so beautiful in the moment. And to bring out that, that argument, Baudelaire has given the example of the dandy, how the dandy works upon himself to present an image of himself, which is a kind of an invention of a completely new personality. Okay. Let me add just one final word. This ironic heroization of the present, this transfiguring play of freedom with reality, this ascetic elaboration of the self, Baudelaire does not imagine that these have any place in society itself or in the body politic. They can only be produced in another, a different place, which Baudelaire calls art. So in conclusion, he says that all these things that he has spoken about, the flaneur, the dandy, that, transformation of the reality into something which it is not through the use of the imagination, all these things are actually not possible in, they don't have any place in real society, so as to say, but they have a place which, and that place is in art. It is in art that this attitude of modernity can be essentially and completely expressed. Okay. So we have about 7 minutes left. So let's continue reading. I do not pretend to be summarizing in these few lines either the complex historical event that was the Enlightenment, or at the end of the 18th century, or the attitude of modernity in the various guises it may have taken on during the last 2 centuries. I have been seeking, on the one hand, to emphasize the extent to which a type of philosophical interrogation, one that simultaneously problematizes man's relation to the present, man's historical mode of being, and the constitution of the self as an autonomous subject, is rooted in the Enlightenment. So all these examples that Foucault has given, these are all only so that he may be able to define or understand what enlightenment actually is. How enlightenment informs man's relation to the present, how enlightenment defines man's historical mode of being, and how it, guides the constitution of the self as an autonomous subject. All these things are to be found in the Enlightenment. On the other hand, I have been seeking to stress that the thread that may connect us with the Enlightenment is not faithfulness to doctrinal elements, but rather the permanent reactivation of an attitude, that is, of a philosophical ethos that could be described as a permanent critique of our historical era. I should like to characterize this ethos very briefly. So he says that enlightenment is not in following any doctrines. Enlightenment does not consist in following any kind of theories or set principles or doctrines, but rather in a reactivation of an attitude which he calls the philosophical ethos. In the reactivation of a philosophical ethos in us, which he says could be described as a permanent critique of our historical era, which could be, which could be a comment on this historical era of the, or rather, how the Enlightenment has created this kind of a philosophical ethos that has come down even to the contemporary times. So he says, I should like to characterize this ethos very briefly. I'm going to stop here today, okay? We have 3 minutes left. So let's stop here. Is there anything you would like to discuss? Otherwise, you can leave if you want. If you want, you can leave the meeting.
Ma'am, can I ask something? Ma'am, that might be a very naive question, but what he means here is enlightenment is individual. It's individual for a person. It's not collective, right? So what you feel is enlightenment for you is for you. That is what he says. It might be different for everyone. Is it so?
That's what he's saying, that enlightenment is an attitude. It consists of, enlightenment is in the attitude, and enlightenment is when each individual comes to an understanding of the legitimate use of reason.
Right.
Yes, so it is something that should inform an individual's, attitude. And when each individual is aware of his role, of how he can use his reason, then that would build up into the entire, humanity. Then one could say that the entire humanity of that, from that time or of that time, was enlightened, because they were all aware of the proper use of reason. He has always associated enlightenment with the use of reason.
Reason.
The gaining of knowledge through the proper use of reason, of the power of reason. And reason is something that is individual. It is for the individual to understand the proper and legitimate use of reason. Only then can that individual contribute, or such individuals can come together to build up an entire humanity that could be called enlightened.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.